one of the things that just really kind of blew my mind away as a young person was realizing form mattered. So it wasn't just the substance or the content of a work of art, but the how of its saying that mattered. But that when we say that it mattered, it's not just because some forms are better than others, some works of art are more beautiful than others, but because that forming process of the artist opens onto the forms of reality. It's a way of knowing the world. And therefore, it's a way, it has the potential to, as Rilke puts it, to change your life.
My friends, welcome to The Literary Catholic, a program where we unpack life-changing stories from centuries of Catholic literature, connecting you to God and inspiring both your faith and imagination.
My name is June-Ann Greeley, and we're very honored to have with us today James Matthew Wilson, arguably one of the most important voices in contemporary American Catholicism, a poet, scholar, and public intellectual. Just very briefly, a little introduction to James Matthew Wilson. He is the Cullen Foundation Chair in English Literature, the founding director of the MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas. He's the author of 16 books, the most recent collection of which is St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, from Word on Fire in 2004, and that's going to be sort of the focus of our interview, as well as The Strangeness of the Good from 2020, which won the Poetry Book of the Year Award from the Catholic Media Awards. The Dallas Institute of Humanities awarded Mr. Wilson the Hyatt Prize in 2017. Memorial College gave him the Parnassus Prize in 2022. And the Conference in Christianity and Literature twice has given him the Lionel Basney Award. In addition to his role at the University of St. Thomas, he serves as the poet in residence of the Benedict XVI Institute. He is scholar in residence of Aquinas College, editor of Colosseum Books, and the poetry editor of Modern Age magazine. So, welcome, Mr. Wilson. And thank you for taking time with us today, especially during Holy Week on Holy Wednesday, to speak with us. So I thought maybe just to get us started, and for our audience out there, if you could share with us a little bit of your background, and I think particularly the formative years that maybe led you towards being a writer. I know a lot of times, I know teaching students that people are always curious about how does one sort of become a writer. So if you could maybe share a little of your background with us, and particularly how maybe writing or reading or literature played a role in that.
Sure. Well, one of the moments that I remember with 40 years retrospect fondly, I'm sure it wasn't the most pleasant experience at the time, was standing over my brother Jason's shoulder when he was writing an essay on Shakespeare's Julius Caesar for his high school English class.
Okay.
And I remember watching reading what he was writing and being fascinated by the argument and, of course, the plot of the play, and reading the quotations and just dying to know what would happen and how the play ended up, etc. You know, I was too young to know that it was a tragedy, so with death. And after a few minutes, my brother just got irritated having his younger brother hovering over his shoulder and shooed me away. And it was many years before I ever actually read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar and actually got to enjoy it for myself. But that was one of those moments where that was probably the first moment where I realized not only that there was something interesting about literature, but even the act of writing about literature, of thinking about literature, was something that was actually fascinating. I doubt very much my brother was fascinated by the essay he was writing for a class, but I was certainly fascinated by it.
Wow.
And so it was around that time, actually, that I began writing. I started off in my career as a fiction writer. I went to the University of Michigan to write fiction in the Hopwood creative writing program, and indeed had written multiple novels and was shopping them around with agents. One day I just woke up and thought, this isn't what I want to be doing. I want to be writing poems. And that was caused by two things. One was just in my leisure hours, I was reading poetry and not much else. And so I wanted to put my effort where the heart was, as it were, and where the joy was. But there was a second aspect to that. And it was from the moment that I first encountered meter, the use of versification to refine language and to bring it into order, an order both rhetorical and musical. I was completely transfixed by it. I think it sort of combined an interest in mathematics with an interest in words in such a, and in it, not to mention interest in music in
Sure.
several ways, and it was all there at once, and and writing prose sentences was just no longer something I found particularly interesting. I wanted to write lines of verse, and so I've been doing that for the last 30 years now.
That's a fascinating story. Do you remember how young you were when you sort of was leaning over your brother and watching him write about Julius Caesar?
Yeah, I would have been in seventh or eighth grade.
Wow. And
Yeah.
even then, there was something that drew you to this amazing craft of thinking about words and then also writing about those words. Um, and you mentioned that your movement from fiction to meter had something to do with that's kind of where you landed in terms of your heart, or it just seemed to work better for you as in terms of what you wanted to express.
Well, there were so many things that convened upon the election of poetry, I guess.
Sure.
You'd say. Uh, Again, it was almost a haphazard introduction to meter in a course in college that got me thinking about it. Um, and this was years before I switched from writing fiction to writing poetry. Although I write a lot of poetic fiction. In fact, it's all poetic fiction. Uh, but that was it was one afternoon. The professor was trying to explain to us what iambic pentameter was so that he could explain a Shakespearean sonnet, not by Shakespeare, but by Claude McKay, the
Oh,
first
sure.
great Harlem Renaissance poet.
Yeah, yeah.
And we were looking at his sonnet America, and I loved the poem, and I just loved the thought of trying to put words into pentameter, and I ignored the rest of the day's lesson to write one line of pentameter. But I brought that line home, and after dinner, went up to my garret dorm room and wrote 13 more lines. And by the end of the night, I had a sonnet. I went running down the hall to show my friends what I had done, and everybody was kind of amazed because they had no idea what these rules, as it were that
Oh,
that
sure.
lead you to make something, that's not just a poem, but or not just writing, but a sonnet. And for the next subsequent 4 nights, I came home and did it again and again until I had 5 sonnets. And it was one of the great exhilarations of my life to just count out those syllables, to count out those iambs. But I also just said, well, that's not what I do, and set it aside and went back to writing fiction.
Writing fiction. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting when you bring up that so much of this happened when you were a college student, because I'm sure you know, being in the academy, I mean, I teach also in the academy, that of all the genres we try to get across to students, it seems that poetry, I don't know, it just seems the one that they most often roll their eyes at, or they're just kind of disaffected by. I mean, most students enjoy, if if they enjoy fiction, they'll read fiction or creative nonfiction. Even students reading drama, but there's something about poetry. And I was wondering, just from your own experience, not even just as a writer, but even as someone who maybe instructs in it, what is it about poetry you think that you obviously sort of embrace that maybe we could share with our students? This is why, because I mean, I love poetry too. I'm not a writer though, but this is something you should, pay more attention to or be aware of, as
Well,
opposed to just the fiction writing, which has its place too, of course.
sure. The place to start, I think, would be with something like classical music.
Okay.
Very few people uh, have a very serious interest or appreciation for classical music if
Sure.
they haven't been trained in an instrument. And while it's not absolutely essential by any means to know how to play an instrument, to have such knowledge and interest, that's usually the way in which people become literate in music. That's the way they learn to read a score,
Right.
just through
Right.
their own practice of one of the instruments. And
Yeah.
once you understand the intonations of cello, once you understand how to play a violin, um, you you have an interior knowledge
Mm-hmm.
of the practice of music and the art of music that you otherwise wouldn't have. And of course, having music theory is even more essential, but most people's practice path to music theory is just through performance. Um, once you have that inside knowledge, the music becomes super intelligible to you.
Mm-hmm.
That
Sure.
it's speaking a language that you also speak. We don't expect such a sort of gateway and initiation to be required for literature, and with an obvious reason. Everybody speaks, whereas not everybody knows how to play an instrument or to read a score. Uh, but uh, but there is such an initiation, and of course, with poetry, it's even more the case because it entails not simply a grasp of grammar and basic sentence construction. It requires not simply a grasp of rhetoric and rhetorical form. It also requires being able to hear versification. Now, we hear it whether we know it or not, but to hear it and know what you're hearing in the same way that you can listen to Beethoven's Seventh and hear it without really knowing what you're listening to.
Right.
I think just conveying that insider's knowledge, so making sure that that just like James Matthew Wilson in 1992, that if you're talking about a sonnet, that you have them also figure out how to write a line of verse. Yeah. I would just add, going back to the 18th century, prosody was thought to be part of grammar, and there's a more complicated history to it. But let's just say that if that means that to know grammar, to be literate, you really have to know prosody.
Yeah.
And most professors would not let a college student or even a high school student graduate without being able to write an essay. There was a time where you wouldn't have been allowed to graduate without being able to write a passage in verse, and for the same reason, because both entail a mastery of English language, a mastery of rhetoric. So if we think of it that way in terms of mastering the medium in which we speak, but also entering into it, so you're not, as it were, an outsider looking in on the language, but you're truly in possession of it. I think it's inevitable that students will fall in love with it. That's what I found. I work with a lot of I work with high schoolers for a couple days every summer. And they're all writing sonnets. And I think the reason they're mad about poetry is because they have learned how versification works. They've done workshops with me on the ballad and on iambic pentameter, et cetera, over the years. And that leads them to see what poetry can do and the the role that it plays in a good life.
That's fascinating because just as you were speaking, I was thinking it makes perfect sense because students, let's say in college or high school, are doing a lot of prose writing, right? They're writing papers, they're writing, anything that's in a declarative voice. So they're used to that. But are they writing poetry? And this idea you have of creating the poem and working the poem, and then you enter into poetry, I think that's a wonderful tip. If I might steal it from you in, my classes, because, students get very anxious around it and the words are difficult and the images are difficult. But I think you're right. If you ask them to engage in it, that's a very powerful motivation to learn more about it and feel comfortable with it.
Yes.
So that's great.
I think so. It's, of course, important to really show them the full breadth of the tradition, too.
Of course.
A lot of people's entrance into it, their first encounters with poetry, will be either something poorly constructed and highly just therapeutic or emotional. This is a lot of contemporary poetry.
I was going to say,
or merely fragmentary and obscure. We have T.S. Eliot to thank for that. And that those are usually not the best places to start. That's the other thing, is a lot of our what has gained, sometimes for a good reason, reputation as canonical or great works of literature are often not actually that interesting.
So start with Shakespeare or Petrarch or something along those lines if you want to.
I think so, yeah.
Them into it. That's a great idea. So moving from this idea of just the writing that you do, we'll be getting a little bit more into the content. I thought we could talk a little bit about the importance of Catholicism and the idea of contemporary Catholicism, obviously in your own life and then in the material that you write. And I was wondering if you could first speak a little bit about just maybe your own faith journey, if you had one. And then I have a question about some of the writing you've done about, I think, very fascinating on contemporary Catholicism. But if you could share a little bit about your own life, if it was a traditional Catholic family or was this a a journey you made on your own to the deepening of your faith over the years?
It was certainly a traditional Catholic family. We're a very, very faithful family. A pretty no-nonsense family, though, too. As I will sometimes joke that, the last thing we were going to do after church on the way home was talk about the homily or something like that.
Okay.
More likely to talk about what time tea time is afterwards. I don't mean tea, but I mean
Right.
golf. So,
Okay.
and but and so even though I went to St. Thomas Aquinas school, all I knew about St. Thomas Aquinas from going to school there was was his brothers trying to tempt him with a woman. I
When he
knew nothing of his monumental achievements as a theologian. I don't know if I could have understood him if he had been told them. But it was during my college years that I encountered Dante for the first time, pretty much by something I certainly ascribed to Providence. And if it wasn't Providence, it was complete dumb luck and fortuity. Discovering Dante, and then through Dante, Thomas Aquinas, and strangely enough, also through another poet who I had encountered in just sort of my desultory reading, the California poet Ivor Winters, who was no Christian, but was a great admirer of Aquinas and also of the great Neo-Thomist philosophers and historians of philosophy, Etienne Jasson and Jacques Maritain and others.
Sure, yeah.
And it was by and large, it was in no small part through just reading his poems and then his literary criticism that I just came across these pretty much random footnoted references to the great tradition of our church. And of course, everything I encountered was brilliant and life-changing. I'll back up though for just 1 second. The strange dimension of this, maybe I should say the unexpected of it, is that I wouldn't have been, as an adult, a serious Catholic had I not first been serious about writing. I think most people, if they have any interest in the arts and literature among them, will pretty quickly reach two conclusions, which are the conclusions that any casual reader of a book will discover on his own. And that's, first of all, that form matters. You can tell you can tell instantly the difference between someone who knows how to tell a story and order a plot and write dialogue, and someone who can't. And you could tell instantly somebody who's got an ear for the perfect line and who doesn't. So form is absolutely central to everything. But what is that everything? It's certainly the case that works of fine arts give pleasure, and that we would not spend much time with them did they not give various kinds of pleasure. But that pleasure is always secondary to, or an effect of, rather than the reason for, the kinds of discovery, delight, and insight that we get from works of literature. And so one of the things that just really kind of blew my mind away as a young person was realizing form mattered. So it wasn't just the substance or the content of a work of art, but the how of its saying that mattered. But that when we say that it mattered, it's not just because some forms are better than others, some works of art are more beautiful than others, but because that forming process of the artist opens onto the forms of reality. It's a way of knowing the world. And therefore, it has the potential to, as Rilke puts it, to change your life. And so I had a lot of writing friends in college, all fiction writers. And we were very different people in most respects. But there were two things I would say that we had in common. And that was we acknowledged together that form mattered and that works of art could change your life. And with those two convictions, you could have a very long and happy friendship. But I think it was recognizing that and taking seriously what I was reading that really led me deeply into the church. First through Dante, through Flannery O'Connor, through T.S. Eliot, through all the great novelists, Catholic or otherwise, who had a sense of the orderliness of things and the need for order. William Faulkner was a great early influence. Not to mention Dostoevsky and and in a different way, Franz Kafka and others. Uh, all of those literary influences made me think the discovery of order that's made possible in works of art has to issue into something that's not just me. And I eventually discovered that it was the order of the church, the vision of the church that I was being guided towards.
Yeah, that's fascinating because when you think of form and order, you also think of the very orderly way in which, liturgy is created, and the notion of the power of how the liturgy structure is so important. And it is, as you said, it's obviously content, but it's also the way in which it's presented and the way in which it's received. So that's a wonderful way of thinking about the idea of how the work you did as a writer kind of brought you into a deeper conviction, if I may, it seems like, with your Catholic faith. So I read a lot of your articles, because you also are a prolific writer and you also write essays, and I was very interested in your take on what your thoughts were on the Catholic culture and how it's changed over the years. And there was a longish quotation. I won't read all of it, but I wanted to ask your thoughts because I think it's so relevant to what's going on today. And you were in this piece that you wrote called "The Death of Catholic Culture," which is interesting because I'm also a cradle Catholic and I grew up in Boston. So I understand what you mean by there's a Catholic culture that's not just sort of made up in someone's mind.
Yeah.
But you wrote something, and if I could just read a little bit, I'd love your thoughts on it. And you wrote that ignorance of the church's faith is just a symptom of an even more grave condition. It is one thing not to know the doctrinal expressions of particular sacred truths. It's another thing and more serious thing to live one's life with a worldview blind to and uninformed by those truths. And a little further down, you write the same piece. Plenty of persons affirm their belief in God or confess they accept myriad other formal doctrines of our faith, while they see the world with eyes of indifference and unbelief. One can claim to believe in a God who died for our sins, while at the same time thinking about the world as if none of that business had happened. I here do not speak of hypocrisy, but of a loss of religious feeling. And I found that just very powerful and very moving. And I was wondering, first of all, if you could address this idea of a loss of religious feeling, and then if we could maybe loop back a little bit to your thoughts about literature, poetry, art, music.
Mm-hmm.
Are those going to be the vehicles, do you think, in today's culture to restore some of that religious feeling, or is that one of the ways we can? But I just would like your thoughts on this very compelling idea of the loss of religious feeling in contemporary culture, as you write.
First of all, let me thank you for looking up that article, which I wrote, almost 20 years ago.
I know, I would love your work.
It was teaching as a postdoc at Notre Dame.
Okay.
I want to mention one point that will be immediately intelligible from that quotation, then I'll go into something else. The first one is I just was rereading Waugh's Brideshead Revisited this last week, and what Waugh describes in that book, or what he dramatizes in that book, are people who in many cases have ceased to believe, or thought they ceased to believe, in the truths of the church. People who think they believe, but don't really understand. And really only one character seems to believe and to know and understand. And he depicts those people, however, making some very hard choices in their lives out of adherence to the teachings and the truths of the church, mm-hmm. despite their own personal feelings or desires. The ultimate moment being when Julia, the female protagonist of the novel, abandons the hero or protagonist of the novel in order to, and doesn't marry him out of fidelity to the church's teaching on marriage, because she would be committing adultery were she to marry him and enter into a second marriage. But there are several instances of that kind of faithfulness despite oneself. And we could describe that faithfulness despite oneself in a number of ways, including just the persistence of feeling. And that's how I described it in that article.
Right.
But the church teaches us that passions are rooted in the will, and the will is nested or rooted in the intellect. And the intellect is our capacity to encounter being, to know the truth, to be open to the fullness of reality so that we can go out into the world, but that the world could also enter into us. And that's what learning is. And in fact, that's what living is for intelligent beings,
Right.
is to receive the world as an object, objecting to us, throwing itself up to us, giving itself to us. Wisdom is receiving that gift of being and ordering it with one's intellect so that you can see the way the world works, the way reality is. And so it's certainly the case that a loss of feeling is significant, but it's also certainly the case, and you mentioned this a few minutes ago with your discussion of the liturgy, that that what we find beautiful, what may affect us at the emotional level, is also and always and even more fundamentally speaking to us at the ontological level, at the level of being, and at the intellectual level. The form of the liturgy is not just about what makes it pretty. The form of the liturgy is offering the right form of sacrifice to be worthy of God, the true and worthy sacrifice, the logo latria. And so any prettiness, any beauty it might have to it, isn't some separate reality from the truth of it or the goodness of it. That beauty is fully integrated with the truth, with the being, with the form, the essential form of the liturgy. And so what I was getting at there long ago is to switch sort of vocabulary for a second. For a lot of people, there's what Cardinal St. John Henry Newman called a notional assent to realities. But the notional assent he differentiates from a real assent, from a full embodied assent where your intellect that says yes is affecting your will, which also says yes by its own activity, by its own movement. It's moving in love towards God and the divine.
Right.
And it's certainly the case that that in our age we are very, very fragmented. In that passage you read, I hear some echoes of T.S. Eliot, which were no doubt intentional. And Eliot, of course, famously spoke of the dissociation of sensibility, where feeling and intellect were cut off from one another. And I think that he was basically right in that modern people tend to be very sentimental, or very intellectual, and sometimes both in different categories of their life, but rarely the two things together. And that's not a way of living in the world that's in keeping with the reality of the world as such, nor the reality of human nature. And so in that essay, I was trying to find ways to reintegrate the human person, to have us recognize that the truth is there for our assent, but it's really there for our assent, our saying yes with not just our reason, but also our will, with our fullness of feeling. That's what conversion is.
And do you find that this is something that in sort of the contemporary church is lacking? Are people not able to make that kind of assent, or it's, as you mentioned, it's a kind of bifurcated assent, or they're not even really sure what they're assenting to? Is it something has changed over, I'm not sure, maybe the generations or last, several decades, do you think? Or has this been sort of an ongoing pattern?
Well, we're all such a mess. I don't know. We always have been, but things are always getting worse, I suppose. You mentioned growing up in Boston, and before I wrote those paragraphs that you read, I had lived in just on the outskirts of Boston, Teal Square in Somerville for a year, and spent a couple years also in Western Massachusetts. So I came and I volunteered in the church with young people there. So I really got to see, the decline of the Boston church at firsthand and from the inside. So I've seen a lot of things over the years that would all correspond to this sort of bifurcation or this disintegration of intellect and feeling in different ways. At Notre Dame, it was more often people who very doggedly assented to the truths of the church, but unknowingly had, what somebody like Bishop Barron might call a sort of practical atheism to their life. They may speak Thomas Aquinas, but their feeling was all John Locke or something, or Thomas Hobbes, to put it pretty abstractly. In Boston, and then later in Philadelphia, I witnessed for the first time, ethnically Catholic people sensed a great deal of possession over the Catholic Church, but felt no need to be possessed by it.
Right. Right.
And that was, that was quite a challenge to encounter. People who, couldn't be bothered to come to Mass on Sunday, but if you then threatened to close their parish, they were going to be up in arms. That was quite an experience. And so there's no one diagnosis, I think, that we can speak about the contemporary Catholic Church, or even about any one part of it. But I unless we were going to really abstract to a pretty high level, which is that we're all struggling and failing often to be integrated in the way St. Augustine's Confessions calls us to be. We're trying to become one with ourselves, but we can only become one with ourselves through being one in communion with God and with his creation. That's everybody wants that. I mean, the 70s therapeutic culture was full of people talking about self-actualization and integration, all kinds of stuff that came to them through psychology, but could have just as well come to them from Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. And, they're onto something. They're just maybe not finding the best way to do it. Let me read a poem, actually, just since I brought up Boston. There's a poem in here that may have struck you from the first part of the book, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, called Teal Square, Sunday Morning.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that, actually.
It's dated summer 2001, which can lead some people to a little confusion, because the fall of 2001, most people will, of course, associate with the September 11th attacks.
Right.
But the reason for the title here is that it was also that fall and then into the winter that the Boston Globe first broke the clerical sexual abuse scandal. And I had and so this is about I had just left Boston, so this is the months before.
We didn't realize
before I leave Boston and before that scandal breaks, when there's a certain complacency and joy in the air. But you'll see by the end of the poem that I anticipate the future coming. Teal Square, Sunday morning, summer 2001. Just as I sauntered down the front porch stair into the brilliant flood of Sunday morning, my collar pressed, pants creased, and without care, as if the world shrugged off all signs of mourning, I caught sight of the dive bar on Teal Square. And there, left blinking, helpless, lost in light, a man and woman who'd just been kicked out, their cash all gone, shamed at each other's sight to exit premature some drinking bout that now seems poised to finish with a fight. The man calls out to me across the street to ask me for $1. I just smile and pass on, but observe the morning heat already overcoming hope and guile as their pink faces settle in defeat. I can't be bothered, really, and arrive at Mass just as the bell begins to toll, squeezing into a back pew all alive with children fleeing their mother's tired control. One peers at me, then takes a sudden dive. And here, an hour, we listen, sing, and pray. The day is ripe and everything's so clear. We scarcely glimpse what else might come our way. But when months on the dark headlines appear, joy stops, doors shut, and few of us will stay. That's that's rooted in a true story in a few ways, including that there was a dive bar just across from my house. It soon gentrified and got nice French doors as Boston went up, but I remember those people being kicked out of the bar on a Sunday morning. And actually, I've written more than one poem about them. I was so fascinated by the usually more indirect than this one. So fascinated by their misadventure. And of course, there's a certain echo of the prodigal. Or sorry, not the Good Samaritan story, of course, here, but
right.
It wouldn't really be being a better person to give the prematurely drunk $1 for a beer, and yet the complacency, the sense that nothing can go wrong and I can't be bothered really, when since 2001 we've really had nothing but bother.
I was going to say, now, would you say that you're the narrator? Are you also the person in this, or are you sort of picking a character of this is how some other people have walked by
Yeah.
and done that?
I so even when a lyric poem is in the first person for me, I'm always taking liberties with the
Okay,
character. I'm
sure.
trying to use my imagination. Sometimes when the subject matter is very explicitly autobiographical. So, for
Good.
instance, in my first book of poems, Some Permanent Things, I included a sequence, poetic sequence called Four Verse Letters. That's four verse letters to my two brothers and to each of my parents. And there's a lot of actual autobiography in that.
Mm.
But I also inserted totally fictional things that were not in the least bit
Okay.
true. Um, because just in part, some of them quite capriciously, just to remind myself that my duty is to making a good poem and not to
Mhm.
not what's
The
in
story.
the background of the poem.
Right.
And so I'll often in the first person uh, make myself an even worse person than I am, just for the opportunity to um, explore dimensions of my character, myself. I mean, I'll use a character to explore my characters and the constitutive properties, the vices and the virtues of who I am and who we all are. I'll actually digress on that for just a second. Uh, that I think the modern author who does that most conspicuously is Flannery O'Connor,
Oh,
where
okay.
her short stories are almost all, small segments of herself that have been inflated like balloon animals into full-size human beings.
Mhm.
Um, my daughter Livia, who loves Flannery O'Connor, was reading everything with Rise's Much
Convert. Yeah.
Converge story about segregation and racism and also self-righteousness and manners. And she sat and talked with me for about 3 hours about that story, going over the characters, trying to understand it. And I mean, she did a marvelous job. She really did understand it, but she still felt unsettled about about the whether she really grasped the story. And I said, the reason, after she talked for about 3 hours, said, the reason you feel unsettled is because the main character in that story, who's being narrated and who's clearly not the hero of the story, because
Mhm.
he has a self-righteous, and then he abandons his political causes, out of desperation when he finds that his mother, stunned, possibly killed by the swing of a purse of a black woman. Uh, that character who you could either say, well, he's right because he's on the right side of history, he's the liberal defender of civil rights, or he's wrong because he's pretentious and ungrateful to his mother and embittered and resentful. Um, he's both those things at once, and Flannery O'Connor clearly that's her, that's Flannery in that story. Uh, in a persona, and she's just trying to take a raw, unadorned look at herself, or rather a part of her personality, and to understand it for what it is. And so it's neither to be praised nor to condemned. It's there to be, to be understood. I i realized I didn't realize for a long time how what a great path to self-knowledge making things up is. But that's certainly the case. I'll just give you an example from my own work in my second book, uh, The Hanging God. It's a Spencerian sonnet sequence about a man in the Midwest who has just fallen into, speaking of dive bars, the dive bar part of the world, and it has and it retells the story of his romance with a stripper who is a pathological liar. So she strips herself of her clothes, but she also strips herself of
True.
everything except her body, because everything about her is a fiction. Um, and and the sonnet sequence traces this guy's gradual sort of degradation until he is as degraded as she presents herself as being. And when I was writing that sonnet sequence, I'd write one of them. Could never write more than one of the 14 sonnets a day, and I'd come and sort of stew around in the kitchen, and my wife would look at me and say, "What's wrong?" And I'd say, I just don't know if I'm doing the right thing." And it's because
No.
to imagine that story, I had to go down into the real sub basement of my character and find the worst parts of it, and then let those parts believably have free reign to act as they would, to understand them in their dramatic truth.
Actually, the way you're describing it, it reminds me a little bit of Dante, because when Dante decides to write his journey, however we want to think of it, he
Mhm.
has to go to hell. And
Mhm.
there's some dark places there. Now, I don't think all the characters are obviously necessarily expressing Dante, but you're right. You really have to hold up the human condition fully. And I think the beauty of what you write here and what you were just explaining with Flannery O'Connor is the complexity of the human person. None of us is all of one of anything. And this idea of this is one of the poems I'm so happy you mentioned it, because I was really moved by it in the sense that the two men and women coming out of a dive bar, I don't know, has that become their church? Has that become their place of
But
safety? Has that become the only place they find solace, and they've been kicked out? And then this idea of, a man going to his church, is that his place of safety? Is it just his place of, refuge? Is it a place just to bide his time? And then, as you say later, few of us will stay once the doors are closed. Well, these people are trying to get in. I know the multifaceted level which
yes,
our
yeah,
humanity expresses itself. It's wonderful.
yes,
Um, Speaking of, since we're already on the book, everyone, if you
yeah.
see this, I want to mention this wonderful cover. I'm a medievalist, so I love the cover that you have
Oh,
here.
yeah. Uh-huh.
Um, I would wonder if, I mean, I don't know if you'd mind reading some poems, but only because he's a favorite of mine, and is the title, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, which I think is just such a wonderful moment, because as you mentioned, so for those of us who know St. Thomas Aquinas, he's
Review.
this sort of formidable character. He's this brilliant theologian, philosopher. Nobody can touch him. And yet you have such an intimate scene with him as he's older now. He's probably always a little cranky, but he doesn't move too well. He's angry at one of his scribes. Have they done the work? And he has this scene in this sort of this idea of Thomas and the birds and the forbidden birds. And I don't know if you'd mind reading it and talking about it, because I think it kind of carries this book in so many ways. Um,
I mean, I have to agree when I and it's astonishing to me that this should have become the title poem of the book, uh, because it's so providential or fortuitous how the writing of it came about.
oh, I was
I
going to ask you
read,
about that. How did you write
yeah.
this story, this
Well,
scene?
more more consistently years ago, but to this day, when I can, I will read Aquinas, the Summa after morning prayer. Flannery O'Connor would read it in bed at night. I'm not that kind of guy. I'm more of a morning person for my theology. Um, and uh, and so I was making my way through the treatise on law in the Prima Segunda, and as Aquinas is going through the old law, there's a long article on the Mosaic law and the forbidding of the consumption of certain kinds of birds.
Right, right.
And it's a very long article because he goes through all of the birds and he gives a spiritual and allegorical or moral interpretation of why each bird is forbidden consumption.
Mhm.
And so, first of all, a lot of theologians will contrast classical figural and spiritual theology, the theology of the church fathers, where it's all exegesis of scripture, but reading for the four levels of meaning that
Right.
modern people they might know only through Dante or through Flannery O'Connor for that matter, with the scholastic method, which seems so dry and scientific rather than imaginatively looking into the spiritual significance of things. But here was Thomas Aquinas doing what all the church fathers did within an article of the Summa, and therefore proving that he had united the church's tradition so beautifully.
But
But then he was doing one thing more, and that's as a medievalist, I bet you've gotten to really enjoy medieval bestiaries.
oh,
It's
of
just
course.
amazing. I made a friend back in Pennsylvania who collected bestiaries, which
Okay.
must have been a very expensive hobby. Um, but the lore of understanding the different animals and all that they did and communicated.
Yeah,
Here was Aquinas being a good medieval man, giving us a bestiary of the birds.
that's a great way of putting it.
I just thought this needs to be put into heroic couplets. So I just started making couplets based on Aquinas's own observations. I had no intention of writing a poem, but by the time I'd done that, I was sitting in the room with him. As it happens, I've visited the, also kind of by dumb luck, the church where he wrote part of the Summa in Rome. So I had some firsthand experience of it. Even one of my best friends in graduate school was at the Medieval Institute at Notre Dame. He was one of his specialties was the paleography of Thomas Aquinas. So I've seen giant blow-ups of pictures of his shorthand.
Handwriting.
So I really kind of lived with Aquinas in many different ways for many years. And so I think after I was putting his own words in verse, the whole world in which he lived just suddenly appeared to me. And so here it is. St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. Beyond the window, morning sparrows made their song as if the whole world's goodness paid its plenty out for them and them alone. The old saint heard their joy and squelched a moan as his legs, stiff and heavy still with sleep, arranged themselves beneath his cassock heap of belly. Where had he left off before? He asked his three amanuenses, more for their sakes, sprightly fingers, sluggish minds, than his. One said, with the forbidden kinds of birds, and what their figures signified for Moses, who charged the eagle's flight with pride. Aquinas sat a moment, mind withdrawn from his mouth's taste of buttered loaves, the dawn without, the wish for more wood in the fire to clear the frost from stone, or to admire the cool, swift brilliance of all he said, as a swan plumes its white and well-turned head. He spoke. The long-beaked ibis feeds on snakes to represent the man whom nothing slakes. Feasting upon dead bodies' open gore, the vulture stands for all who thrive through war. When Noah let the raven out to fly, it never did return, to signify such men whose souls are blackened by foul lust, or who unkind won't pay back trust with trust. The plodding puffball ostrich is that which figures all those weighed down with growing rich, and hearing God's call, plant their soiled head. Plovers like gossips on stray words are fed. And who, on seeing the gull, does not admire that its bright wings to heavens may aspire, and yet it wastes its hour adrift at sea, gorging on fishy sensuality. The hoopoe builds its nest on heaps of dung, just as despair's eyes view the world all wrong. He paused then at the thought of earthly sorrows, our sickly past, incarnadine tomorrows, the myriad things that whistle arcane truth to please old minds and to instruct raw youth, and bore down on his broken knees to pray for such a world that had so much to say.
Wonderful. So in looking at, this, I don't know, that's so intimate experience of St. Thomas Aquinas, the old saint, as you mentioned him, and he's kind of, there's that one line where he talks about, wishing there was a little bit more heat and so on. Why did you want to, well, first of all, what do you make of what he says of the birds? And then why did you want to title your collection of poetry, this recent collection, after this poem? And what did you want the reader, or at least the person interested in reading your poetry, to have a sense of by using this as your focus, or at least the title?
So a few things. First of all, the old saint, and that you have at the conclusion of the poem, near the myriad things that whistle arcane truth to please old minds and to instruct raw youth. So first, the great theme of this book is that the intellectual life, the contemplative life, the spiritual life, the ascent of the mind to truth and to God is the telos of the human person. But of course, we wreck it in so many different ways. We don't use our freedom wisely, and we don't use our call to become, to live in God's image very well. So the book is full of not full. The book is substantially marked out with coordinates, with points, with individual poems about the evils of history, the bombing of Dresden, the assassination of Cicero, the the Dyers of Marie Monk, which is in a coded way about the sexual abuse crisis in the church. All of, there are a few poems on that subject. But to show the persistence of order, and in fact, that strange fact that no matter how overshadowed by misadventure or plain evil history is, we actually pretty much can't help but assent to the identification of being with goodness that is first revealed to us in the book of Genesis. And so the sort of second theme of the book is that amidst the evils of history, we nonetheless find the world absolutely saturated in what people would call meaning. That is to say, that being is one with goodness, it's one with truth, it's one with beauty. Being is always bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And so the poem, or excuse me, the book as a whole tries to move between these two moments in Aquinas's life: the perception of the intelligibility of things, the depths of being and the depths of meaning in reality, so that we can interpret birds in a spiritual and allegorical way, amongst other things. But that also, one of the responses is not just to that reality, is not just to offer prayers of praise and contemplation, but also prayers of reparation and penance and grief for the incarnadine tomorrows of this world, the sickly past, the fact that there's that history has always been a mess, even though it's also kind of perfectly ordered. So the book moves between that, and it tries to, and I tried to have actually the book have several movements where we enter into the beauty of things, the depravity of things, and come back from them and then explore them once more.
Yeah, I was going to mention that it strikes me that there are several poems here, and I do want to get to a couple of ones that are a little bit more, particularly Elizabeth's poem, but there's several poems here, like Lilacs and The Garden, where you do reference sort of the beauty of the natural world in a way. There's something in the Lilacs poem at the very end where you have someone sort of conscious of the physical material world, and yet somehow it's connected, as you mentioned, the ethereal visitant. So knowing that St. Thomas is, I don't know, Thomas, St. Thomas is, sort of working intellectually with this idea of the birds and their meaning, and yet at the end you have him down on his knees for such a world that had so much to say. And I have to think it's what the world has to say to his head, but also to his heart, like all the richness of this world and all its brokenness, and yet somehow there's a beauty, there's a meaning, there's a form, there's a wisdom, there's an intelligence that's sort of in that, which is really, an encounter with wonder. It's sort of, you don't think a lot of times with Thomas. And in several of the poems that you have, as I said, Lilacs, Snowfall, The Garden, there's a sense of this physical material world that seems to speak about more than just, isn't it pretty? Or isn't it nice? That there's some sort of, as you mentioned, the goodness that's inherent. And if we can capture that, maybe that's the place where some people have to begin to have their experience of the transcendent, of the divine. I'm not sure if that's where we are. But with that said, there was a poem that sort of towards the end of your book, Elizabeth and her cousin, because you do have several poems, of course, that are explicitly very religious, very theological. But this one I found just, a few questions, maybe before you read it, if you could be sort of thinking about it. First of all, just what brought you to the Visitation? Why this particular poem? Why Jacob of Surrey? I thought that was an interesting link there. And what, you could, some people might say, well, we all know the story of, Mary going to see her, serving Elizabeth, that sort of thing. But I think you're doing something very different with this. Well, not very different, but you're doing something more personal with this particular piece. So anyway, if you would be willing to read the poem, it's just a few stanzas, not too long, and then sort of explain your process of why this story. Why do you want us to read your thoughts on this story, this narrative?
This is a great one to read following St. Thomas
I
the
think so
Forbidden
too.
Rose
Yeah.
for a couple of reasons I'll explain after I read the poem. Elizabeth to her cousin. Blessed are you, O maiden. Blessed the fruit which dwells within your womb. Beloved in that holy rest whose secret comes to sacred bloom. And blessed is this virgin birth which shall uproot sin from the earth. Who grants this favor to me now, that you should come, O blessed one, bearing the great who is made low? By his own will this thing is done. The mother of a king, and yet it's at my wooden door we've met. Let every mouth speak out your praise, and all the seraphim stand shaken. Your womb contains the brilliant rays that from a living flame shall waken this world, whose sleep is sin-black night, gives way before new life and light. The gardener who clears the thorns, a lion's cub, whose jaws shall roar, louder than all of Joshua's horns, and drive all craven wolves before. Such is the sun that all shall see, arise from you as from the sea.
Mhm.
But who am I, that you should come, bearing the one who made the world, who is its Savior and its sum, and yet within you now lies curled? I am unfit, Ancient of Days, to welcome you or speak your praise. But, Lady blessed and full of grace, I see your beauty and rejoice, the radiant flush upon your face, a living water in your voice, disclosing what alone you know, that light and word within you grow. No angel spoke this truth to me, but he who dwells within me stirred the moment that my eyes could see your distant form, and my ears heard your call as down the hill you came, bearing that secret, ancient flame. So this poem has an origin very similar to the St. Thomas poem.
Oh, okay.
During morning prayer before reading the Summa, I read my Magnificat, and one of the meditations in Magnificat years ago was a passage from Jacob of Sarug, and I read it, and the heaps of metaphors that he was piling upon Christ and upon the Blessed Virgin, all on the occasion and on the feast of the visitation. I just thought this really needs to be put into verse.
Yeah.
So I sat down and did it. I don't think I realized, possibly for months, that Sarug was one of the many church fathers, the early church fathers, who wrote in verse primarily.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've got Saint Ephrem, a good friend of mine, works on Saint Ephrem's poems, and they're amazing to read. So I was really just restoring to verse what Magnificat had translated into prose. I didn't know at the time, and I didn't want it to be a direct translation. I've done quite a few of what used to be called versions, which are very loose translations.
Sure.
Robert Lowell did a lot of that in the 1960s, and this is one of them, because there are places where I depart entirely from Jacob, but others where I adhere quite closely. I don't know who, Jacob or I, made up the gardener who clears the thorns, but I particularly love that line.
Oh, I love that line too. And I also love the line, the mother of the king, and yet it's at my wooden door we've met.
Mm-hmm.
There's something very homey about that image. I mean, the meeting of these two women, I mean, we know who the women are, but it's also this meeting of these two women, and sort of like Thomas bending his arthritic knee, and St. Thomas bending his arthritic knee, that you have him, and just wondering at the world, and how in this very intimate encounter of these two women, it's this it's the story of the universe. It's kind of the glorious mystery. It's such a wonderful take on Elizabeth. It's a very, I don't know, I find it very personal and beautiful take on that story with the gardener, and the idea of it being both here but also kind of beyond what we see here. Lovely.
In scripture, the various canticles,
Right,
are just so are real, magnificent moments. Both, thinking back to the Old Testament, the canticle of Hannah, when she proclaims her joy to the priest Eli that she's pregnant with Samuel, who will be the prophet Samuel, and then the canticle of Zechariah, and of course the Magnificat itself.
Yep.
These are all just such astonishing moments where human speech does something that it doesn't do every day. And that's where it becomes pure doxology, pure praise.
I was going to say, yeah, pure praise, pure praise.
And I think it's one of the challenges of being a poet, to try to find language that, this is not something one does all the time. This is something one does on occasion, but to try to find that language that actually rises up and actually even steps out of narrative context and the dramatic tensions of historical life and can just be pure, timeless words. That's one of the fascinating challenges of poets, is because so much of what we do, just like any fine artist, and specifically any narrative artist, like a fiction writer, novelist, we're telling stories. If we didn't do that, nobody would want to read poems. But there are moments in every human life, and there are moments in literature where time has to sort of fall to the side or fall away like clothes, and something completely eternal rises up. And so those canticles are the moments in Scripture where that happens. And so it's wonderful to get to imitate them.
Yeah, and this idea of sort of I don't know, what is transcending the human somehow has to be captured by the human. You do it, and it is that's momentary, and yet nevertheless it captures something. And the love of Elizabeth for her cousin, as to use your title there, it's quite moving. For anyone watching, this is the wonderful book, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, with a wonderful manuscript piece that has a picture that has the image of the birds. And I want to thank you, James Matthew Wilson, for this wonderful conversation. It was such a joy and such an honor to speak with you and hear you talk about your wonderful work. So I wish you all great good luck and Easter blessings also to you and your family.
Same to you and everyone who might listen to this.
Thanks so much.